The following is a redacted version of our criminal justice system within the federal courts. This summary is designed to offer insight into the operations of our federal courts and the U.S. Probation and Pretrial Services Office. For more detailed information, please visit the U.S. Courts website at www.uscourts.gov. The U.S. Probation and Pretrial Services Office for the District of Minnesota continues our efforts to educate the public and future practitioners concerning the role U.S. Probation and Pretrial Service Officers have in our system and community. We continue our series with Presentence investigations. Adjudication represents the third stage of the criminal justice system. During the adjudication stage, criminal defendants are arraigned on the charges formally filed by the prosecutor. It is during this time where the parties usually engage in plea negotiations, ultimately resulting in a plea. In the federal courts, most criminal defendants enter a plea of guilty as part of their negotiations. If pleading not guilty, the case is set for trial. After pleading guilty, and the court accepts the defendant's plea of guilty, a pre-sentence investigation report is usually ordered. The U.S. Probation and Pretrial Services Office is responsible for conducting the pre-sentence investigation. In doing so, the assigned U.S. probation officer meets with the defendant for initial interview. The initial interview either takes place at the U.S. probation office or local detention facility where the defendant is being held. The initial interview is critical, and it is important that truthful and verifiable information is provided to the U.S. probation officer. The pre-sentence investigation involves an in-depth discussion concerning the defendant's personal family data. The U.S. probation officer inquires about the defendant's early childhood, upbringing, parents and their background, siblings, history of abuse and/or discipline within the household, marital background and/or current and prior relationships, children, and the last 10 years of residential history, ending with the defendant's current residence of where he or she will reside if released or remaining on bond. The U.S. probation officer will conduct a home visit to verify and inspect the residence. The purpose is to ensure the residence is suitable for the defendant's success under supervision. It also highlights residential stability and ties to the community. Physical and mental health history are important to update the court of a defendant's current medical status. If committed to the Bureau of Prisons, the defendant's medical history will be important for classification purposes and facility assignment. The U.S. probation officer also inquires about a defendant's history of controlled substance usage and treatment. This information helps the U.S. probation officer with recommending court-ordered programs to assist the defendant while in custody and upon release. It may also offer insight as to why a defendant participated in criminal activity, and it may be helpful to the court with respect to sentencing. The U.S. probation officer inquires about a defendant's educational background. This information is helpful as it allows the U.S. probation officer to recommend potential educational and/or vocational programming. The educational data may also highlight critical information which may involve learning disabilities. Military data is also obtained, reviewed, and reported to the court. This is important as the U.S. probation officer may identify specific veteran-related services which can be beneficial for addressing court-ordered programming. The U.S. probation officer also used this information to highlight a defendant's achievements while serving in our armed forces. The U.S. probation officer is also interested in learning more about a defendant's employment history. This offers insight into a defendant's skill sets and how one earns a legitimate income. The time frame of employment history is about 10 years. Where there is a gap in employment, the U.S. probation officer may inquire as to how did he or she support oneself during that time period. The U.S. probation officer is responsible for advising the court of whether a defendant has the ability to pay a fine. The U.S. probation officer will inquire of any assets or liabilities to determine a defendant's net worth. The U.S. probation officer will also ask about current income and expenses to determine monthly cash flow. Based on this information, the U.S. probation officer will advise as to whether the defendant has the ability to satisfy a criminal monetary obligation. The U.S. Probation Officer verifies the information provided by the defendant. The U.S. Probation Officer speaks with family members, reviews medical records, academic transcripts, mental health evaluations if applicable, along with treatment services records for substance abuse treatment if also applicable. Requests copies of a defendant's DD-214 if military history exists, and reviews an array of databases to confirm the defendant's social history information. It is highly encouraged to have family members available to speak with the U.S. Probation Officer. Once the U.S. Probation Officer has gathered and verified all of the defendant's social history information, the U.S. Probation Officer begins to prepare the written pre-sentence investigation report. The U.S. Probation Officer reaches out to the government to collect discovery material and summarize the offense conduct leading up to the defendant's arrest. The U.S. Probation Officer relies upon the United States Sentencing Guidelines to offer the court insight concerning the advisory sentencing guidelines in this case. In determining the guidelines, the U.S. Probation Officer also examines a defendant's criminal history. When complete, the U.S. Probation Officer finalizes the written pre-sentence investigation report and submits to the parties for review. Upon receipt of the pre-sentence investigation report, the defendant is encouraged to review the report in its entirety and alert his or her attorney of any inaccuracies. Through his or her attorney, the defendant should offer additional contact information and/or documentation to the U.S. Probation Officer for further verification or reporting of information. The defendant and his or her attorney should provide as much information as possible to the U.S. Probation Officer, which may aid in mitigation of punishment. Upon receipt of all correspondence from the defendant via his or her attorney, the U.S. Probation Officer will disclose a final report to the court and parties. The U.S. Probation Officer will also submit a recommendation letter to the court concerning disposition in the case. The parties return to court, where the pre-sentence report is reviewed with the court. Once all issues have been resolved, if applicable, the court shall proceed with sentencing the defendant.